Hey everyone. Tonight, we're stepping behind the roaring crowds and the blood-stained sand of the Colosseum. Beyond the clashing blades and roaring beasts lurked a figure who pulled all the strings, the Lanista. Not a warrior, not a hero, but a dealer in human flesh and broken dreams. He was part prison warden, part ruthless talent scout, the shadowy master who trained, bought, and sold gladiators like cattle. So, before we dive into the darker corners of Rome's brutal entertainment machine, get comfortable. Take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy drifting off to these twisted tales from the past. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's slip into the world of the Lanista together. Okay, let's travel back, shall we? Imagine Rome at its noisy, garlic-breathing, blood and marble peak. You're standing in a city that smells like sweat, ambition, and the faint copper tang of yesterday's games. Somewhere out there, maybe behind a gated courtyard or tucked away in a dingy back alley, is a man you wouldn't want to invite to dinner but absolutely needed to keep the mob happy. The Lanista. Now, what exactly was a Lanista? Well, think of him as a talent scout, prison warden, fight promoter, and borderline mob boss rolled into one. But before he was all of that, he was more often than not something else entirely. And usually, that something else was unsavory enough to make respectable Romans clutch their togas a little tighter when he walked by. Many Lanisti got their start in the blood trade because they'd already been on the losing side of a sword at least once. Ex-soldiers who knew how to handle a blade, patch up a wound, or bark orders at men twice their size. Some were disgraced centurions, men drummed out of the legions for insubordination or scandal, who decided that if they couldn't fight for Rome, they'd make a living feeding her appetite for flesh instead. Why not? The skills transferred neatly: recruit, train, DSPLN, profit. No emperor's orders required. Others were criminals, thieves, extortionists, or men with debts so high they'd never crawl free without turning to the business of blood. Rome was a city that churned through human lives like firewood, and sometimes the only way to keep from burning was to light someone else instead. For these men, becoming a Lanista was a grubby, half-respectable step up. Better to manage killers than be hunted by creditors or rivals. Then there were the freedmen, former slaves who'd clawed their way out of benge with a combination of street smarts and sheer gut rot. Freedmen couldn't hold office or command armies, but they could own property. They could run businesses. And if you were a freedman who knew how to spot a broad-shouldered Thracian or a desperate Roman citizen willing to sign his life away for a purse of coins, well, the arena was open for business. And let's not forget the clever entrepreneurs. Not every Lanista was born in the gutter. A few were just canny merchants who realized early that the real profit in Rome wasn't in olives or amphorae but in men. Living, breathing, bleeding men. When your audience demanded novelty, violence, and spectacle, a stable of well-fed, well-trained gladiators was worth more than a vineyard in Sicily. More thrilling, too. But no matter how a Lanista started, soldier, criminal, freedman, or entrepreneur, they all ended up in the same bucket when it came to Roman law. The bucket labeled infamia. Now, infamia was Rome's way of saying, "You're officially gross." It was a legal brand. You couldn't sue for slander because, well, you were already considered a stain on polite society. You were lumped together with PMPs, actors, prostitutes, anyone whose trade involved bodies on display for money. Gladiators themselves carried the same mark, of course, but their managers, oh, they got a special layer of scorn because they made the whole ugly circus possible. Did this matter in day-to-day life? Absolutely. A Lanista could be rich, filthy rich if he played his cards right. He could wine and dine senators, slip bribes to magistrates, and host roaring feasts for local big shots. But the minute he stepped out of the party lights, he was still a man with infamia. His word weighed less in court than a baker's apprentice's. His children, if they were lucky, might claw free of the stain. But he, never. The irony, of course, was that Rome needed her Lanisti. Desperately. The gladiatorial games were Rome's social glue, her bread and circus, the thing that kept the restless mob from setting the city ablaze every time grain shipments ran late. But the same senators who lined up for front-row seats were quick to remind everyone that they were above the men who provided the main event. Philosophers sneered about the moral rot of the arena, while they snuck in with friends to watch a favorite Murmillo split a man's skull like a melon. The common folk gossiped about the shameful life of the Lanista, yet they bet good money on which gladiator would last the longest. The irony was thicker than the blood on the sand. And the Lanisti themselves? They leaned into it. They were realists. They knew no matter how many coins jingled in their purses, they'd never be invited to sit at the Senate's inner circle. They were the necessary filth that kept the machine running. And maybe, just maybe, they relished that power. The power to turn a farm boy into an arena god, to command loyalty through fear and the promise of freedom, to hold life and death by the scruff of its neck and decide who lived to fight another day. In the shadows behind the Colosseum's grandeur, all marble and echoing cheers, the Lanista paced the training yard. He barked orders at recruits, counted coins from bribes, kept one eye on the doctor sewing up a split lip and another on the gate where a desperate man might try to bolt for freedom. He knew that while the crowd roared for the gladiator, it was his ugly, indispensable hands that made the show possible. So next time you picture Rome, don't just see the emperors with their laurel crowns or the patricians with their silk tunics. See the Lanista too, the half-proud, half-despised ringmaster standing ankle-deep in the grit and guts of Rome's favorite sport. See the ex-soldier with a scar that runs from ear to chin, the ex-SLV counting coins by candlelight, the streetwise entrepreneur laughing with a mouthful of olives while his fighters sharpen their blades. See him, remember him, because Rome did, and so did the men who died, lived, and sometimes clawed their way to freedom under his watchful, unblinking eye. Of course, if you really want to understand how the Lanista's reputation got so thoroughly dunked in dishonor, you need to take a stroll through the Roman moral mind. And, fair warning, this stroll is less pleasant garden promenade, more sewage trench lined with philosophical contradictions. See, Rome was a city built on what they called mos maiorum, the customs of the ancestors. This meant family honor, personal diespel, public virtue, all those shiny ideals that senators loved to bang on about while dipping their fingers in every scandalous pie they could find. The Roman moral code was a lot like their sewers, mostly hidden, occasionally impressive, but never as clean as they claimed. Under this system, professions were divided into the honestiores, the honorable, and the infames, the ones who, in theory, shouldn't be trusted to water your ficus. Farmers? Good. Soldiers? Very good. Senators and orators? Excellent, so long as they didn't get caught doing anything they routinely did. But managers of human chattel, men who made a living buying, breaking, and renting out fighters to sate the public's appetite for blood? Absolutely bottom shelf. Philosophers, especially the Stoics, had a field day with this. They'd stand in marble porticos, draped in their simple cloaks, and lecture about virtue, temperance, and the moral rot of the games. Seneca, that silver-tongued moralist, once wrote letters lamenting how the games turned men into brutes, each fight a sign of Rome's creeping decay. He wrote this, of course, while living comfortably under an emperor who threw more than a few of those games himself. Hypocrisy? Maybe. Or maybe just the cost of staying alive in a city that loved its contradictions. Every so often, an outraged senator would try to limit the games, cut down on the excess, ban the more depraved spectacles. But they rarely touched the Lanista directly. After all, he was just the middleman. Easier to look noble by cursing the sin while doing brisk business with the sinner. And the people in the cheap seats? The ones crammed shoulder to sweaty shoulder in the Colosseum's upper tiers? They had opinions too. Ask any fishmonger or cobbler or tavern girl about the Lanista and they'd spit on the floor, then ask when the next fight was scheduled. They despised him and needed him in the same breath. Rome was like that. A city that loved to watch a throat get cut but preferred someone else handle the blade. But perhaps the strangest, saddest part of the Lanista's world was how many of the men he managed had put themselves there. Not all gladiators were slaves dragged from foreign battlefields in shackles. A good portion were octorati freeborn Roman citizens who, facing crushing debts, bad luck, or sheer desperation, signed contracts to sell themselves into the arena. Picture it. A young man, head down, shoulders hunched, knocking on the heavy wooden door of the ludus, Rome's gladiator school. Maybe his farm failed. Maybe his father's debts strangled the family's future. Or maybe, just maybe, he's addicted to the thrill, the only thing that makes his heart drum like a war chant. Whatever the reason, he steps up to the Lanista's table, hands over the contract, and just like that, he becomes property. It was a grim transaction, but the Lanista knew exactly how to handle it. He'd weigh the boy's arms, run his thumb along the bones to judge if they'd break easy. Check the teeth, because rotten teeth make for weak fighters, and weak fighters don't sell tickets. Then he'd lean in close, voice calm as a butcher's prayer. Fight well, and maybe you'll earn your freedom. Fight poorly, and you won't live long enough to complain. That promise of freedom was the bait in the trap. And it wasn't entirely a lie. Some gladiators did win their liberty. Their rudis, the wooden sword that meant you'd fought enough, bled enough, and survived enough to be allowed out of the sand. But only a handful ever tasted that bitter triumph. Most left the arena feet first, to be dumped in a shallow grave with a crude marker, one more nameless prize for Rome's insatiable hunger. And the Lanista? He pocketed the coins either way. Behind every famous name carved into the graffiti of the Colosseum stone walls, every Murmillo and Retiarius and Secutor, who became a fleeting hero, there was a Lanista's ledger with their purchase price, medical costs, and a note in the margin if they were likely to bolt. For the manager, a fighter was a walking investment, a slab of muscle wrapped in the thinnest veil of humanity. The trick was keeping that investment alive just long enough to pay for itself, but not so long that it became a liability. This cold calculus turned the Lanista's job into an endless balancing act. Feed the men enough to keep them strong, special barley diets, extra oil for the skin, a doctor who could sew up a gash with a half-stolen surgical needle. But not too much food, because gluttony made them slow and spoiled. Give them hope, the promise of bonuses, fame, maybe that rudis in a few short years, but not so much hope they started plotting how to slip a dagger between the manager's ribs while he slept. And sleep? That was a luxury the Lanista rarely enjoyed. Nights inside the ludus were tense. He knew that every locked cell was a powder keg. A single breakout, a whisper of rebellion, and the men who once fought for him could fight against him. The more brutal the training, the more brutal the fallout if fear gave way to rage. Some tried to sweeten the iron bars with small mercies. A coin slipped to a veteran who kept the rookies in line. A round of watered wine on feast days. The chance to bed a willing admirer from the crowds, because yes, there were Romans who saw gladiators' scars not as shameful marks but as trophies, proof that they'd brushed shoulders with death and survived. And a gladiator who felt like a star was less likely to turn that fame against the hand that fed him. But not every Lanista bothered with perks. The worst among them were brutal as the whip they carried. Floggings, starvation, isolation cells, these were standard tools of DSPLN. And when fear wasn't enough, they'd bring in the doctors, the drill masters, to grind any spark of rebellion into the sand. One lesson at a time, one bruise at a time. Yet for all the cruelty, the Lanista could never forget one simple truth. He was just as disposable as the men he owned. Rome's appetite for blood was fickle. One bad show, too many dull fights, a breakout, a bribed official turning on him, and his fortune vanished like smoke from a sacrificial fire. A good Lanista knew how to play the long game. Keep the local magistrate sweet with an extra cut of the earnings. Send an especially talented fighter to perform at a rich senator's private party. Yes, those happened, and yes, they were exactly as grim as they sound. Whisper a little gossip in the right ear to sabotage a rival's contract. This wasn't just about swords and sand. It was about politics, bribery, and a web of dirty favors spun tight as a net. And when that net failed, well, that's how you got cautionary tales Lanisti who flew too close to the sun, who thought they were untouchable until they woke up with debts bigger than their stable, or a knife in the dark, or a riot tearing through their precious ludus like a pack of wolves. Rome loved nothing more than building up a monster and then tearing him down, cheering both the rise and the ruin with equal delight. So, next time you hear about the glory of the games, the roar of the crowd, the glitter of the emperor's thumb turned up or down, spare a thought for the man pacing in the shadows behind the arena wall. The one making the deals, counting the wounds, placing bets on flesh he owned but never truly controlled. The one who knew every scar, every fear, every dream of every fighter under his care, even as he sold them to the sand. The Lanista didn't fight in the arena. He fought in the corridors behind it with law, with public scorn, with the endless, grinding weight of infamia strapped to his back like an iron yoke. And maybe, just maybe, he laughed a little when the crowd called him vile. Because deep down, he knew the truth that Rome never liked to say out loud. There was no honor in blood sport. There was only the business of survival. So what became of these men when the games grew bigger, bloodier, and Rome's hunger outpaced its shame? Did the Lanista get a little redemption? A promotion to polite society? A seat in the Senate beside the men who feasted on the spectacle he served up? No, of course not. He stayed right where he always was, half inside, half outside. Too essential to discard, too repulsive to embrace. If you were a Lanista, your gold could buy you a new tunic, a fancier villa, even a handful of eager patrons who pretended not to GG when you joined their dinner party. But you were still the man who trafficked flesh. You were still infamous. And that stain didn't scrub off no matter how many amphorae of wine you poured over it. It didn't help that the business only got uglier as the empire expanded. Rome's armies bled new slaves into the market with every campaign. Gauls, Germans, Greeks, Africans, they poured through the gates of the city in chains. And who stood ready to scoop up the strongest, the fiercest, the ones who looked good swinging a gladius? The Lanista, like a carrion bird circling a battlefield, he knew where the real profit was. He'd haggle with SLV traders in smoky back rooms, run a thumb along a man's ribs, pull a woman's jaw to check her teeth. He'd wink at a magistrate who wanted a custom match for his son's birthday, a duel that would make the family look powerful, ruthless, worthy of the old Roman bloodline. And he'd watch the coins pile up, even as the city's moralists wrote another tedious scroll lamenting Rome's decay. It's tempting to think that in a world so dedicated to the ideal of honor, a man like the Lanista would want to break free of that crawling disgrace. But some leaned into it instead. They knew their power didn't come from polite company, came from the shadows, from the hush-hush deals, the bribes slipped to local officials, the secrets they held about which senator's cousin fought under a false name, which festival was rigged, which games ended in murder made to look like sport. To be a Lanista was to be a walking, talking threat, needed, reviled, always half a heartbeat away from ruin or revenge. And yet, for every ruined manager who wound up gutted in a back alley or drowned by debts, there were a few who survived long enough to retire. Some bought vineyards and lived out their days pretending they'd always been humble farmers. Others shifted their business, turning old gladiators into private bodyguards for rich clients who wanted muscle without the shame of hiring mercenaries. Some just disappeared, lost to the ruins of the arena walls, their names scoured clean by centuries of wind and forgetfulness. Because that's the final bitter truth about the Lanista. Rome loved him when the crowd needed him, when the mob was restless, when the bread was stale, when the emperor needed a distraction from taxes or scandal or war. But once the crowd fell silent, once the empire's taste for blood waned, once the Colosseum's gates rusted shut and the sand stopped soaking up the noise, the Lanista faded like a bad dream at dawn. His legacy didn't get carved in marble or cast in bronze. You won't find his name engraved in heroic lists alongside Rome's generals or philosophers. His mark is there, instead, in the faint ghost of a roar that still clings to the stones of the old arenas. In the graffiti scratched by someone's desperate hand, spiculous, champion, undefeated, a name made possible because a Lanista once bought him, fed him, and threw him to the wolves called Rome. And when you stand there, staring at the battered skeleton of the Colosseum, you're not just seeing Rome's glory. You're seeing the truth the marble tried to hide. That behind every laurel crown and gilded statue stood men who wore infamia like a second skin. Men who traded shame for coin, who turned desperate bodies into the empire's favorite bedtime story. So remember him, the ex-soldier who drank too much and dreamed of his old legion days. The freedman who learned to turn a SLV's chain into someone else's collar. The hustler who winked at the law, spat at the philosophers, and kept the mob roaring long enough for Rome's empire to survive one more festival, one more day. In the end, the Lanista was Rome, raw, hypocritical, and addicted to the thrill of the kill. He was the rumor behind the roar, the dirty hands behind the spectacle, the necessary evil who stood just outside the marble gates, counting coins with blood under his nails. And when the empire crumbled, when the dust covered the old stones, when the last gladiator's name faded into legend, the Lanista's echo was still there, a reminder that every glorious empire needs its monsters, and that sometimes the monster is just a man with a ledger, a whip, and the courage to do what polite society pretends it doesn't want done. So, let's follow the Lanista's echo down a narrow alley through an iron gate, past a pair of bored guards who barely look up from their dice and step inside the ludus. The gladiator school, the real beating heart of Rome's appetite for blood. Forget the marble steps of the Colosseum. Forget the crowds waving palms like they're blessing some holy festival. This is the raw backstage, the place where men became fighters or corpses long before they ever set foot on the sand. Picture it. The air inside the ludus is heavy, like breathing through old oil and sweat. Wooden swords clack against battered shields. Men grunt, spit, bark curses in every language the empire devoured: Thracian, Gaulish, Greek, Latin. In the corner, a SLV sweeps up blood-stained straw. Nobody notices the fresh stains. There will always be more tomorrow. Here, the gladiators live like prized cattle, too valuable to lose, too dangerous to let roam free. Their cells are cramped stone closets, iron-barred like a cage at the menagerie. Some keep little tokens on the floor: a carved figure, a scrap of cloth from home, a lucky charm wrapped in twine. Small comforts that can't stop the nightmares but maybe blunt the edge of fear just enough to sleep. Each morning starts the same. The doctors, those grim-faced drill masters, many of them old gladiators themselves, drag the men out into the yard before dawn. They run drills until the sun climbs high enough to turn the yard into a frying pan. Stabbing, blocking, dodging, a dance of muscle memory hammered into bone. A good gladiator doesn't think when he fights. He just reacts. That's how he stays alive 5 seconds longer than the fool across the sand. The Lanista lurks nearby, arms folded, eyes narrowed. He watches how they move, how they breathe. He's calculating which men need more feed, which ones need the lash, which ones are worth bribing the medicus to patch up just one more time. Each man is a walking investment, a walking risk, a walking rebellion waiting to happen. Because the ludus is less school, more prison, a pressure cooker waiting to blow. The cells stay locked tight. The gates are double barred. Guards prowl the yard armed with cudgels and short swords. You can feel the tension when the sun goes down, when the drills stop and the bruises start to throb. No one talks too loud at night. Fear has a way of making even the biggest man whisper. Yet the brutality of the place was balanced by its strange kind of nurture. A gladiator had to be strong, which meant he had to be fed, and fed well, at least by the standards of a man expected to fight for his life on command. The diet? Barley gruel, thick and heavy, cheap but dense enough to bulk up a man's muscles. So much barley that the gladiators were nicknamed Horderii, the barley men. Not exactly a name to strike terror into the mob, but the crowds didn't see the daily meals. They only saw the end result: slabs of muscle honed for slaughter. Meat if you were lucky, beans, onions, maybe fruit if a merchant owed the Lanista a favor. Wine diluted with water. Not to celebrate, just to keep the blood flowing warm enough to fight another day. And when you fell, there were doctors, 2 early sports medics who could stitch up a gash, splint a snapped arm, or drain an abscess before it poisoned the whole body. Rome didn't invent sports medicine, but the ludus made it an art form. Broken noses, punctured lungs, dislocated shoulders, the Medici patched up the walking wounded like carpenters fixing cracked beams. If you were a good investment, you got the best care the Lanista could buy. If you weren't, well, there were always fresh slaves to replace you. Of course, the training yard wasn't just bruises and barley. It was punishment, too. Brutal, relentless, humiliating punishment. Talk back to the doctors? Shackled overnight in a cold cell. Try to run? Beaten bloody in front of the others. A living warning not to test the gates. Plot rebellion? A death sentence slow enough to make sure the others learned the lesson down to the marrow. And yet, and this is what makes the ludus so perversely Roman, the same man who whipped you today might hand you a bonus tomorrow. A coin slipped into your palm for a good fight. A promise that if you kept winning, you might earn your freedom. Or your own sleeping cell. Or a chance to bed the same tavern girl who once tossed roses at you from the stands. Because fear alone wasn't enough. Not for long. A man with nothing to lose is a dangerous man. A man with just a scrap of hope that someone you can chain to the sand year after year. But the Lanista's worry didn't end when the cells locked at night. No iron bar could cage desperation forever. A hungry man, a wrong word, a dropped key, that's all it took to spark a riot that could swallow the whole ludus in an hour. More than one manager died in his sleep, clubbed to death by the same fighters he fed and bled for. So every sound at night was a threat. A scrape on stone. A hushed whisper between cells. The clink of a hidden blade stolen from the training yard. The Lanista lay awake listening to the walls breathe, praying the iron held. And what about the men themselves? The ones who dreamed of the roar of the crowd even as they feared it? Some fought because they had no choice, slaves from far-off lands, plucked from smoking villages, chained in holds that stank of salt and vomit until they reached Rome's gates. Others signed up willingly. Octorati, they came through the gate with heads bowed, contracts in hand, trading 10, maybe 20 brutal years for a chance to feed their family back home or die trying. In the ludus, they were equals in chains. Did they hate the Lanista? Of course. But they also needed him. He was the one who kept the barley flowing, the oil for their skin, the medicus for their wounds. He was their jailer, their manager, sometimes their only hope of one day walking free if they survived the sand. In the dark corners of the ludus, men told each other stories to keep their courage alive. Stories of champions who won their freedom. Of men who walked away from the arena carrying their rudis, the wooden sword that said, "You are no one's property anymore." These tales were as thin as the straw they slept on. But sometimes, hope is the only thing stronger than iron bars. And the Lanista? He leaned against the training yard fence, watching it all. The clang of practice swords. The shouts of the doctors. The men who'd hate him in the morning but might thank him if they lived long enough to see another dawn. He knew this place was a paradox, half barracks, half prison, half theater stage. He knew he was feeding a machine that devoured hope and spat out ghosts. But he also knew this. Without the ludus, the Colosseum's roar would fall silent. The crowd would go restless. The empire would lose one of its favorite illusions, that it was built on honor, not blood. So he kept the cells locked, kept the drills brutal, kept the hope just bright enough to outshine the fear. And every dawn, when the gates creaked open and the barley was doled out by the handful, the cycle began again. This was life inside. The ludus where men were forged into weapons, hope and terror mixed in equal measure, and the manager's heartbeat ticked like a countdown to the next fight. Outside, Rome cheered for heroes. Inside, they made monsters. By now, you might be wondering how a place so grim, so seething with fear and resentment, didn't just tear itself apart every single night. Why didn't the men rip the bars off their cells, throttle the guards, and vanish into Rome's dirty back alleys, never to be dragged back again? Well, sometimes they did. Not every breakout was just a bedtime story. There were riots, blood on the stones. Whole Ludi burned to the ground when the balance snapped. But most nights, the walls held because the Lanista understood one truth better than any philosopher scribbling moral complaints by lamplight. The ludus was a factory, and factories don't run on fear alone, they run on numbers, on food, on carefully rationed scraps of dignity. A man who knows he'll never see sunlight again fights like an animal. But a man who thinks he might someday stand free, he fights like a champion. So the Lanista made the rounds, whispering promises, sometimes true, sometimes just bait on a hook. He let the fighters taste glory when they won. He let the strongest strut in the yard, watched the others envy them, push harder, swing harder, dream bigger. All the while, the bars stayed locked, and the sand stayed hungry. Behind those stone walls, the days blurred together, training, feeding, punishing, patching. A broken arm today was a payout tomorrow if the medicus did his job right. A fight in the yard could settle grudges before they exploded into full-on revolt. A single gold coin slipped under a straw mattress could bind a man to the manager more tightly than iron shackles ever could. But the real trick was what waited beyond the yard. When a fighter stepped through the gates of the arena, he became something else entirely. He was no longer just a SLV or an indebted fool with a death wish. He was spectacle, legend, a breathing promise that tomorrow could be different if he fought well enough. If the gods were willing, if the crowd roared loud enough to drown out his fear. Some wore their scars like trophies. Others hid them beneath layers of oil and the gleam of a new helmet. Some cursed the Lanista's name every night before they slept, fists clenched around splinters of hope that never dulled. But all of them, every single one, were part of a machine that made more money than any farm or fishery or spice trade ever could. Because that's the final truth of the Ludus that no marble statue ever shows you. It wasn't just a prison. It was a gold mine. Every clang of a wooden sword was a coin dropping into the Lanista's purse. Every locked gate was a promise to the magistrates that tomorrow's show would be bloodier, more dazzling, more distracting than the gossip of corrupt senators or the grumblings of the hungry mob. Every fight, every bruise, every whispered threat in the darkness was money. Money for the Lanista, money for the city, money to grease the palms of local officials and keep the games running smoothly. A manager who forgot that who let his Ludus fall apart, let his men starve, let a breakout spark an urban riot, well, he'd lose more than coins. He'd lose everything. Because Rome didn't tolerate incompetence, even among the infames. A failed Lanista was a dead Lanista sooner or later. And so, inside those walls, life pulsed on in that brutal, careful balance, a daily routine of drills and barley, lashes and lucky charms. Hope and despair stitched so tight they were impossible to tear apart. Because inside the Ludus, men learned to swing swords like extensions of their bones. They learned to run at fear instead of from it. They learned that the same man who locked their cell tonight might be the only one to slip them a coin tomorrow. And above all, they learned one simple lesson. Rome didn't care if they hated the Ludus. Rome only cared that they walked out the gate when the trumpets blared, heads high, blades sharp, ready to feed the hunger that never died. And behind them, in the shadows, the Lanista counted his coins, oiled the hinges on the gates, and made sure the whole ugly miracle kept turning. Because tomorrow the sand would need feeding again. So, you've seen the Lanista's world behind the gates, the clang of wooden swords, the sting of the whip, the flicker of hope behind iron bars. But that was just one half of the story. Because the real blood sport didn't always happen in the arena. It happened in Rome's back alleys and marble corridors, the places where men in spotless tunics sipped wine, traded secrets, and counted every drop of blood for profit. If the Ludus was the engine, this was the fuel, the business of blood, the grim arithmetic that made sure the sand was never dry, the crowds were never bored, and the empire's need for spectacle never went hungry. It started simple. A Lanista needed fighters. Slaves didn't come cheap, not the strong ones. Anyway, war was good for business. Every fresh conquest meant thousands of prisoners chained together and marched to Rome's SLV markets. The Lanista would stand their arms folded, eyes sharp watching for broad shoulders, strong legs, an unbroken spirit that could be cracked and reshaped into a crowd pleaser. A good Thracian might cost as much as a small herd of cattle. A seasoned prisoner of war? Even more. And then there were the Octorati, the desperate freeborn men who sold their own skin for a purse of silver and a shot at glory. They were cheaper than slaves, but trickier. If they bolted, the Lanista lost his investment and maybe his neck if the magistrates were feeling righteous that week. Once he had his stable, the real game began. Selling and renting fighters like prize horses. No festival was complete without blood. No local magistrate wanted to disappoint the mob. So the Lanista learned to haggle like a market fishwife, except instead of salted herring, he was dealing in human lives. 50 denarii for 3 rookies? Please, you want the crowd to cheer or boo you out of the forum. Triple the fee and I'll throw in a veteran Murmillo. He knows how to lose with style if that's what you want. Ah, you want him dead in the 3rd bout? Fine, that'll cost extra. Martyrs don't grow on trees. Every contract was inked with the understanding that bribes would follow. Magistrates liked their palms greased coins slipped under the table to get prime slots at the festival. Better placement on the program or a favorable ruling if something went wrong. Everyone was feeding from the same trough, and no one pretended otherwise. Because here's the truth. Gladiator fights were political theater, too. Emperors used them to distract the restless mob when grain shipments ran late or tax hikes bit too deep. Senators used them to flaunt their power. Look how many men I can kill for your entertainment. Now vote for me. Magistrates used them to keep the rabble loyal. And the Lanista? He was the middleman, the fixer who made it all happen. But the business didn't stop with the official contracts. Oh no, that was just the polite part, the part they wrote down on scraps of parchment and sealed with wax. The real money flowed through betting rings. Picture it. The night before a big match. The taverns around the arena hum like beehives. Patrons jostle for elbow room, slamming down coins, placing wagers on who will live, who will lose an eye, who will make the other man squeal before the final blow. Wine spills on the floor, curses fly, and somewhere in the shadows, a Lanista's agent watches, memorizing every bet. Match fixing? Of course. Some fights were real raw, teeth gritted, no way out but death. But others? Let's just say a nod here, a whispered threat there, a promise of extra coin to a desperate fighter who knows he's worth more alive than dead. A seasoned retiarius might slip on purpose, let the secutor run him through, and the right people walk away 10 times richer. And when the bets ran high enough, men were killed not because the mob demanded it, but because the odds demanded it. It wasn't just the Lanista lining his purse. Corrupt guards, arena staff, even the doctors inside the ludus, everyone wanted a slice of the fix. Lose control of that web and the whole operation crumbled. Keep it running smooth, and you could rake in enough silver to buy a senator's loyalty for a season or buy your way out of prison if the fix got sloppy and someone squealed. Of course, not every rival manager played fair. Sabotage was an art form. A well-placed rumor could ruin a man's reputation overnight. Oh, that Lanista? Heard his best fighters are sick. Don't waste your coin. Or maybe you slip a bribe to a doctor in another ludus. Next thing you know, your rival star Murmillo wakes up with a dislocated shoulder the day before the big festival. Oops, accidents happen. Sometimes sabotage turned bloody. A rival's fighters might get jumped on the road to the games roughed up just enough to ruin their performance. If a Lanista got too cocky, too rich, too visible, he might find himself cornered by the same men he used to hire for dirty work. Coins were loyalty until they weren't. But perhaps the strangest twist in all this mess was how high society tangled itself in the blood trade. Senators who preached virtue in the forum sat down to dinner with Lanisti in candlelit atriums. Young patricians, draped in fine linen, leaned over wine cups, begging to be introduced to the newest gladiator stars, the ones who made the mob roar and the girls swoon. Whispers of bribes floated under the chatter. Who owed who? Who'd get the best seats at the games? Which official might look the other way when a Lanista's taxes came up short? The whole thing was one sprawling, oily web, a net woven tight with favors, threats, and the knowledge that one slip could drag you under. Did the average Roman care? Not really. The crowds came for the show, the blood, the roar that made them forget the stale bread at home and the tax collector knocking at their door. They didn't care if the match was fair, if the fighters were slaves or volunteers, if the Lanista paid off half the city guard to keep his stable full and his rivals desperate. They just wanted the sand to stay red. So the business of blood kept churning. Fighters bled. Managers schemed. Senators cheered from marble seats, pretending their hands were clean while their coin purses filled with dirty silver. And through it all, the Lanista, that walking stain, that indispensable scoundrel, kept the gears turning. Because in Rome, there was no spectacle without a price. And the price was counted in bone, breath, and bribes. You can almost hear it, can't you? That brittle silence that hangs over a ludus when dusk settles and the last drill is done. The men have eaten their barley mash. The guards have made their rounds, keys rattling like a threat. The Lanista sits hunched over his ledger, counting fighters like coins, trusting the iron gates to do what iron does best. But even the thickest gate can't hold back desperation forever. Every man behind those bars, every scarred throat that roared for the crowd, every scar that puckered beneath fresh bruises, all of them were reminders that the biggest threat to the Lanista's fortune didn't come from the Senate's backstabbing or some crooked magistrate demanding a bigger cut. No, the true risk sat right there in his yard, eating, sleeping, sharpening hidden blades in the dark. It only took one spark. Ask the ghost of Lentulus Batiatus if you could find him in the afterlife. His ludus in Capua was considered the finest in all of Rome. Hundreds of fighters, seasoned Thracians, fierce Gauls, proven champions who could make the mob roar louder than a thunderstorm. Batiatus was rich, connected, respected as much as a Lanista ever could be. But behind his iron gates, another force was growing. The man history would remember as Spartacus. The story lives on for good reason. A few knives stolen from the kitchen, a plot whispered cell to cell, a handful of men who'd had enough of the sand, the lash, the false promises that dangled freedom like a carrot tied to a sword. One night they rose. They didn't knock politely. They bashed heads, cut throats, broke the locks with raw fury. Dozens poured out of that ludus, clattering through the streets of Capua with stolen blades and an anger so sharp it could slice through any Roman illusion of control. Spartacus, Crixus, Enemaus, names that still make marble senators twitch in their graves. A band of escaped slaves turned a local embarrassment into a full-scale nightmare. A rebellion that burned through the Italian countryside like a brush fire in the wind. Legions sent to crush them failed again and again. It took Rome years, countless dead, and unspeakable cruelty to stamp them out. And you can bet every Lanista from Gaul to Asia Minor lay awake at night after that, wondering if his gates would hold. If his loyal guards would stay loyal when the blades came out. If his prize Murmillo, the one he praised and fed extra meat, might be the first to slip a dagger through his ribs. But riot wasn't the only risk. The threat was everywhere, woven into the very walls. Disease, for example, that silent reaper that slipped through locked doors and laughed at iron bars. The ludus was a perfect breeding ground for filth. Dozens of sweaty, battered men packed into damp cells, sharing food, sharing fleas, coughing into straw pallets that reeked of last week's wounds. It didn't take much a bad cut, a sour stomach, a single feverish night, and your investment turned to a pile of rotting bones faster than any sword could manage. When plague came knocking, it didn't care about the difference between SLV and citizen. A single infection could wipe out a stable worth a small fortune. And who got the blame? The Lanista, naturally. If the games fell short, if the best fighters were buried instead of fighting, the crowd wanted blood anyway. Somebody had to pay. And even if a manager survived disease and revolt, there were other storms brewing, the star fighters themselves. Oh, they looked loyal enough when they stood in the arena, gladius raised to the emperor's box, sweat gleaming under the Mediterranean sun. But in the shadows, loyalty was as slippery as olive oil. Famous gladiators were double-edged blades, good for ticket sales, terrible for peace of mind. A crowd darling could demand better food, more perks, fewer lashes. If the Lanista refused, that same darling might jump ship, sold to another manager, rented out for private shows, or worse, bribed by rivals to throw fights and ruin the stable's reputation overnight. And woe to the Lanista who crossed a gladiator with friends in high places. Imagine explaining to a senator why his favorite fighter ended up dead in a back room, throat slit after a suspicious accident. A smart manager kept his stars well-fed, well-oiled, and just happy enough to keep the knives pointing outward. But if there's one thing Rome loved more than blood, it was scandal. And scandals were the final nail in the coffin for any Lanista who forgot his place. Picture it, word gets out that a manager's fighters are sleeping with highborn matrons, or that a bribe meant for the local magistrate ended up exposed in a rival's poison letter to the Senate, or that a secret training match turned into a drunken slaughter that left the Lanista's best men lying dead in the yard like butchered oxen. When that happened, moral philosophers pounced like hawks on a carcass. Pamphlets were penned, overnight sermons about Rome's lost virtue, about how the games corrupted youth, how the Lanista was just a glorified PMP trafficking in human flesh. Priests thundered in temples. Senators wrung their hands in the forum, shaking their heads about moral decay while secretly slipping coin to their own favorite manager behind the curtains. And then came the Christians. Long before they were the empire's official conscience, they were its most relentless critics. They saw the games as sin carved into stone. The Lanista was the living embodiment of Rome's addiction to cruelty, a sign that the old gods demanded blood, while the new one preached mercy. Every riot, every scandal, every rebellion in a ludus became proof that Rome was rotting from the inside out. Even the mob could turn. If a star fighter died suspiciously, the crowd might riot in the streets. A beloved champion gone in a rigged fight or a botched escape could turn adoration into an angry mob faster than you could shout infamia. And when the mob turned, even the sharpest sword was useless. A Lanista could be dragged from his bed, kicked down alleyways by the same fans who once begged for free tickets to the show, because the same system that made him powerful made him expendable the moment the spectacle soured. So the risk was constant. Riot from below, disease from within, betrayal from beside you, moral outrage from above. And through it all, the Lanista stayed awake, pacing the ludus yard in the moonlight, keys jangling at his side, ears straining for whispers in the cells, nose twitching for the first whiff of plague on stale straw. And when ruin came, and ruin always came eventually, it didn't send a polite invitation. Kicked the doors in with a hammer. Some managers ended up bankrupt, their fighters scattered to rivals. Some were dragged before magistrates for corruption, only to find their powerful patrons conveniently silent. Some simply vanished, murdered by their own men, buried in shallow graves outside city walls, their bones trampled by the same road that once brought slaves in chains to their door. And what about the survivors? The lucky few who managed to dodge revolt, disease, scandal, and moral fury long enough to shut their gates for good? They drifted into the shadows of history, some rebranded as trainers for private guards and bodyguards. Some died penniless, their stables worthless once the games began to wane. Because when the crowds stopped cheering, when the emperors grew nervous, when the empire itself began to Christianize, the business of blood turned sour. And all those men who made a living feeding Rome's hunger found themselves with no market for the flesh they'd spent a lifetime breaking. In the end, every locked gate, every sharpened sword, every bribe, every promise, it was all built on sand. The same sand that once soaked up the roar of the crowd and the blood of the desperate. And when that sand fell silent, so did they. So, what happens when an empire that's built on blood starts to run dry? Not overnight, no torch thrown into the Colosseum, no sudden thunderclap from the heavens to shatter the amphitheater's bones in one dramatic blow. No, the end came like a slow rot, a quiet, creeping decay that started in the corners, where the marble cracked and the coins trickled out of the Lanista's purse, one thin sestertius at a time. Picture it. A city that once demanded lions and elephants, rivers of blood and heroes made in the sand, now yawns through second-rate shows. The crowds, the same mobs that once rioted when they didn't get enough gore, start drifting away. It wasn't that Romans suddenly discovered mercy. It was that the world was changing faster than the arena could keep up. The empire was choking on its own weight. Barbarian warbands battered the borders. The economy sagged under a mountain of bribes, taxes, and grain shortages. Coins that once flowed like wine dried up, and with them, the grand feasts of blood. Where once emperors threw games that lasted weeks, thousands of fighters, whole fleets of animals, exotic monsters dragged in chains from the edges of the world, now they pinched every denarius until the marble squealed. Smaller shows, cheaper stables, Lanisti forced to haggle down the cost of meat for their fighters, or patch broken armor instead of buying new gear. Some tried to adapt. A few clever managers offered novelty stage tricks, mock sea battles, even illusions of combat that weren't real at all. But the crowds weren't fooled for long. When you've seen a man's head split open in the sand, it's hard to get excited about a painted backdrop and a pair of half-starved fighters pretending to faint. And then came the hammer blow that no bribe could stop. Faith. Christianity had always been the moral whisper in Rome's dark corners, the voice that said maybe this wasn't glory. Maybe it was cruelty painted gold. But as emperors themselves began to kneel before the cross as Constantine I, the once pagan warrior, signed edicts that chipped away at the old ways. The roar of the arena began to sound hollow. Where once a martyr's screams drew cheers, now they stirred unease. Where once philosophers had only written dusty scrolls, now bishops thundered from pulpits about the sin of feeding the beast. Blood for sport became harder to justify even to a city that once carved its identity into every drop. The final nail came in law's iron words instead of iron bars. One decree after another chipped into stone. First, restrictions on the scale of the games. Then outright bans on gladiatorial combat. They were too costly, too cruel, too pagan for an empire that needed new prayers to hold itself together. Imagine the last of the old managers, pacing his empty yard, the training posts leaning like drunks, the practice swords rusting in the corner. A handful of bruised men lingering in their cells, not quite free, not quite needed anymore. No crowds, no bribes, no more filthy coins slipped under the table to grease a magistrate's palm. Some Lanisti tried to pivot. They turned their surviving fighters into private guards' blades for hire to protect senators too scared to walk Rome streets alone after dusk. Others pitched themselves as trainers for household retainers, the muscle behind a rich man's gait. No longer a hero but a guard dog who knew how to break a man's spine for a loaf of bread. A few managed to sell their knowledge to the army tactics, DSPLN, drills that turned barbarians into soldiers. Blood always finds a new channel, after all. But many just vanished. No more coin to pay the guards. No more crowds to demand that the gates stay locked. No more need for the man who once called himself a master of men. He became a ghost, an echo that rattled around the broken stone walls long after the last roar faded. And the Colosseum crumbled too. The great amphitheater, that monument to muscle and fear, fell prey to the same scavengers that once roamed its tunnels, only now they carried chisels instead of swords, hacking away marble to build churches, palaces, fortresses. The sand turned to dust. The tunnels filled with weeds and whispered stories of ghosts, men who once fought, bled, and begged for a freedom that came too late. And what of the legend? Rome's children still spoke of the champions, the ones whose names were scratched into graffiti, whose likenesses danced across faded mosaics. They remembered the roar. But the Lanista, the man behind the curtain, he mostly slipped away. No statues, no poems, just a cautionary tale. This is what happens when you build an empire on the bones of men who dreamt of a different life. When you become so drunk on blood that you forget the sand never stays clean for long. So when you stand at the broken arches of the Colosseum today, when you run your fingers over the pitted stone and hear the echo of the mob, remember this. Behind every roar was a ledger. Behind every fight was a bargain. Behind every champion was a man in the shadows, counting coins that could never buy him a clean name. The arena is gone. The crowds are silent. The sand is dry. But the memory lingers that once, for centuries, an empire fed its hunger with shackles, scars, and the hollow promise that glory would outlast the blood it cost. Didn't. And that, my friends, is just a glimpse into the ruthless world of the Lanista. A man who thrived in a place where freedom and life were always up for sale. But don't wander too far yet, because tonight's journey isn't quite over. Stay cozy, let your mind drift, and follow me now as we leave the roar of the Roman arena behind and slip quietly into the misty tales and whispered legends of old Japan. If you enjoyed the story, remember to leave a like and subscribe. It really helps this little corner of sleepy history grow. Sleep well, dream deep, and I'll see you again soon, wherever history's shadows take us next. Long, long ago, in the mystical land of Japan, there lived a brave warrior known far and wide as Tawara Toda, or as his friends might jokingly call him, my Lord Bag of Rice. But his real name? That was Fujiwara Hidesato. And oh boy, does he have a name change story that's worth a listen. One sunny day, our adventurous warrior decided it was time to shake off the dust and seek out some excitement. So he strapped on his two swords, grabbed a bow that was taller than he was, because why not, and slung a quiver of arrows over his shoulder. Off he went, ready to conquer the world. But not too far into his journey, he stumbled upon the bridge of Sita no Karashi, which stretched over the shimmering waters of Lake Biwa. Now, as soon as he stepped onto that bridge, he was met with quite the surprise. Right there, sprawled across his path, was a massive serpent dragon. Seriously, this thing was so big it looked like a pine tree that had decided to take a nap across the bridge. One of its claws rested lazily on one side, while its tail draped over the other. And get this, it was snoring fire and smoke out of its nostrils. Talk about a bedtime story gone wrong. At first, Sato felt a wave of panic wash over him. I mean, who wouldn't? He had two choices: turn back like a scaredy cat or walk right over this sleeping beast. But being the brave soul he was, he decided to channel his inner hero and marched forward. Crunch, crunch. He stepped over the dragon's body, weaving between its coils like a pro, and didn't even bother to look back. Just as he was feeling pretty proud of himself, he heard a voice calling from behind. Turning around, he was shocked to find that the dragon had vanished, replaced by a strange-looking man bowing deeply. This guy had wild red hair flowing down his shoulders, topped off with a crown that looked suspiciously like a dragon's head. His outfit, a sea-green robe decked out with shells. Sato thought, well, this is either a magical encounter or I've hit my head harder than I thought. Was it you that called me just now? He asked, still trying to wrap his head around the transformation. Yes, it was I, the man replied, his voice earnest. I have a request. Do you think you can help me? Depends, Sato said, raising an eyebrow. Who are you? I am the Dragon King of the lake, he declared, gesturing dramatically to the waters beneath the bridge. And I need your help to defeat my mortal enemy, the centipede that lives on the mountain over there. He pointed to a peak on the opposite shore, looking more than a little distressed. The Dragon King continued, For years, I've lived in this lake with my family, but we've been terrorized by this monster centipede that comes every night to snatch away one of my children. If this keeps up, not only will I lose my family, but I'll be next. I've been waiting here, hoping a brave human would come along, but everyone else just runs away screaming. You're the first one who didn't faint at the sight of me, so I knew you were the one to help. Feeling a twinge of sympathy for the Dragon King, Sato agreed to help. Where can I find this centipede? He asked, ready to spring into action. It lives on Mount Mikami, the Dragon King explained, but it comes here at a certain hour. Let's wait for it together. So, Sato followed the Dragon King down to his underwater palace. And let me tell you, as they descended, the waters parted like a curtain, and somehow, Sato's clothes stayed completely dry. Magic, or just really good luck? What he found was a palace made of shimmering white marble, more beautiful than anything he'd ever seen. Forget the Sea King's palace. This was the real deal. Goldfish, red carp, and silvery trout flitted around, serving up a feast that was fit for a king. Crystallized lotus leaves and flowers adorned the table, and the chopsticks, crafted from the rarest ebony. As they sat down, the door slid open to reveal 10 lovely goldfish dancers, followed by 10 red carp musicians strumming away on the koto and samisen. Time flew by as they feasted and enjoyed the enchanting performance, completely forgetting about the centipede lurking in the shadows. But just as the Dragon King was about to toast Sato with another cup of wine, the palace shook with a thunderous sound. Tramp. Tramp. It was as if a mighty army was marching toward them. Both Sato and the Dragon King rushed to the balcony, and what did they see? 2 glowing balls of fire approaching from the mountain. The Dragon King trembled beside him. The centipede, those are its eyes. It's coming for its prey. Now's your chance to kill it. Sato, not showing an ounce of fear, reassured the Dragon King. Don't worry, I'll take care of this. Just bring me my bow and arrows. And so, the stage was set for an epic showdown between a brave warrior and a monstrous centipede. The Dragon King did as he was told, and our brave warrior, Sato, noticed he had only 3 arrows left in his quiver. With a steady hand, he took his bow, fitted an arrow into the notch, and aimed carefully, then let it fly. The arrow struck the centipede right in the middle of its head, but instead of sinking in, it just glanced off like a bad joke and fell to the ground. Talk about a letdown, right? Undeterred, Hide Sato took another arrow, fitted it to the bow, and let it fly once more. Again, it hit the centipede squarely in the head, only to bounce off harmlessly. This creature was like a bad penny, invulnerable to weapons. The Dragon King, witnessing this spectacle, began to tremble with fear. I mean, can you blame him? Now, Hide Sato was down to his last arrow, and if this one failed, well, it was game over for him and the Dragon King. He glanced across the waters, and there it was, the giant centipede, coiling its grotesque body 7 times around the mountain, ready to come crashing down to the lake. Those fireball eyes were gleaming ominously, and the reflections of its 100 feet danced eerily in the still waters. Then, like a light bulb flickering on in a dark room, Hide Sato remembered something he'd heard. Human saliva was deadly to centipedes. But this wasn't just any centipede. This was a monstrous beast that could make anyone shudder in horror. Still, desperate times call for desperate measures. Hide Sato decided to give it a shot. He took his last arrow, dipped the end in his mouth because, that's not gross at all, and fitted it back to his bow. With careful aim, he let it fly. This time, the arrow struck true, piercing the centipede's brain. The creature convulsed, shuddered, and then, just like that, its fiery eyes dimmed to a dull glare, like the sunset on a stormy day, before fading into complete darkness. Suddenly, a great darkness enveloped the heavens. Thunder rolled, lightning flashed, and the wind howled like a banshee. It felt like the world was ending, and the Dragon King and his entourage were huddled in fear, shaking in their boots as the palace trembled. But then, as dawn broke, the sky cleared, and the centipede was gone from the mountain. Hide Sato called out to the Dragon King, inviting him to join him on the balcony. The centipede was dead, and there was nothing left to fear. Joy filled the palace as everyone rushed out, and Hide Sato pointed to the lake. There lay the centipede's body, floating like a grotesque log, the water stained red with its blood. The Dragon King was beyond grateful, bowing down before Hide Sato, calling him their savior and the bravest warrior in all of Japan. A feast was prepared, more lavish than the first. Imagine all kinds of fish, cooked every way you can think of: raw, stewed, boiled, and roasted, served on coral trays and crystal dishes. And the wine, the best Hide Sato had ever tasted. The sun shone brightly, the lake sparkled like a liquid diamond, and the palace looked 1,000 times more beautiful in the daylight. The Dragon King tried to convince Hide Sato to stay a few days, but our warrior insisted he had to return home. The Dragon King and his family were sad to see him go, but they insisted on giving him a few small gifts to show their gratitude for saving them from their creepy-crawly nightmare. As Hide Sato stood at the porch, ready to leave, a train of fish transformed into a retinue of men, all decked out in ceremonial robes and dragon crowns because, why not? They carried gifts that included, first, a large bronze bell; second, a bag of rice; third, a roll of silk; fourth, a cooking pot; fifth, another bell. Hide Sato wasn't too keen on accepting all these gifts, but the Dragon King insisted, and who was he to refuse? The Dragon King accompanied him to the bridge, bowing and wishing him well, leaving the procession of servants to escort Hide Sato back home with his treasures. Back at his house, his family had been worried sick when he didn't return the night before. They figured he must have been caught in the storm, but when they spotted him approaching, they rushed out to greet him, eyes wide with curiosity about the entourage of men carrying gifts and banners. As soon as the Dragon King's retainers set down the presents, they vanished into thin air. Hide Sato shared his wild tale with everyone, and they soon discovered that the gifts were imbued with magical powers. The bell? Just a regular old bell, which Hide Sato donated to the nearby temple to chime the hours for the neighborhood. But that bag of rice? No matter how much they scooped out for meals, it never got any emptier. Talk about a never-ending buffet. The roll of silk was just as magical no matter how many new outfits Hide Sato fashioned for himself. It never shrank. And the cooking pot? A culinary miracle. Whatever he tossed and cooked to perfection without needing a fire. Now that's what I call an economical kitchen gadget. Word of Hide Sato's newfound fortune spread like wildfire, and since he didn't have to spend a dime on rice, silk, or firewood. He became incredibly rich and prosperous. From then on, he was affectionately known as my Lord Bag of Rice. Long, long ago in Japan, there lived an old man and his wife. Now, this old man was a good soul, a real gem of a guy, always working hard in the fields. But his wife, well, let's just say she was a classic crosspatch. The kind of woman who could turn sunshine into a thunderstorm with just a few choice words. She spent her days grumbling about everything under the sun, and the old man had learned to tune her out like a bad radio station. With no children to entertain him, he kept a tame sparrow, a little feathered friend he adored as if she were his own child. After a long day of labor, he'd come home, and the highlight of his evening was playing with this little bird. He'd let her out of her cage, and they'd frolic around the room together. When supper rolled around, he'd save her the tastiest morsels, because what's a little bird without some gourmet scraps, right? One day, while the old man was out chopping wood, his wife was stuck at home washing clothes. She had made some starch the day before, but when she went to check on it, the bowl was empty. Poof, gone. As she scratched her head, wondering who the starch thief could be, down swooped the pet sparrow. Bowing her little head because, of course, she had been trained to be polite, the sparrow chirped, "It's me. I thought it was food, and I ate it all. I'm so sorry. Tweet, tweet, tweet." Now, you'd think the old woman would be a decent human being and forgive the little bird, right? Wrong. She had never liked that sparrow, often complaining to her husband about the dirty bird, making extra work for her. So, when the sparrow confessed, the old woman seized the opportunity to unleash her wrath. In a fit of rage, she grabbed some scissors and snipped off the poor bird's tongue while it bowed in apology. "I suppose you took my starch with that tongue. Now you'll see what it's like to go without it," she spat, banishing the bird without a second thought. Because, kindness is overrated. After her cruel act, the old woman went back to making more rice paste, grumbling all the while. She starched her clothes and hung them out to dry in the sun, instead of ironing them like they do in England. Because who needs to iron when you can just complain, right? When the old man returned home that evening, he was eager to see his little sparrow fluttering to greet him, ruffling her feathers in joy. But tonight, nothing, not even a shadow of his beloved bird. He hurried inside, slipping off his straw sandals, and called out, "Where is Suzum-san, Miss Sparrow, today?" His wife pretended to be clueless, saying, "Your sparrow? I haven't seen her all afternoon. Maybe she flew away, ungrateful creature." But when he pressed her, she finally confessed, revealing how she had cut out the sparrow's tongue and sent her away. She even showed him the severed tongue, as if it were a trophy. "Here's the tongue I cut off. Horrid little bird. Why did it eat all my starch?" The old man was horrified. "How could you be so cruel?" he gasped, his heart aching for his poor little sparrow. He was too kind-hearted to punish his shrew of a wife, but he was devastated by the thought of what she had done. "What a dreadful misfortune for my poor Suzum-san to lose her tongue," he lamented. "She won't be able to chirp anymore, and that must have hurt like the devil. Is there nothing to be done?" That night, as his wife snored away, the old man shed many tears, wiping them away with the sleeve of his cotton robe. But then, a glimmer of hope sparked in his mind. He would search for the sparrow the very next day. With that comforting thought, he finally drifted off to sleep. When dawn broke, he jumped out of bed, wolfed down a hasty breakfast, and set off over the hills and through the woods, stopping at every clump of bamboo to call out, "Where, oh, where does my tongue-cut sparrow stay? Where, oh, where does my tongue-cut sparrow stay?" He never paused for a noonday meal, just kept trudging along until, much later in the afternoon, he stumbled upon a sprawling bamboo grove. Now, bamboo groves are like the VIP lounges for sparrows, and sure enough, at the edge of the wood, there was his beloved sparrow, waiting to greet him. Can you imagine the joy? It was like finding a long-lost sock that actually matches. He dashed forward, heart racing, to welcome her back. She bowed her tiny head and performed a series of tricks, like a feathered magician showing off her best moves. And, get this, she could still talk. The old man was flabbergasted. How on earth can you chat without your tongue? He asked, half expecting her to pull a rabbit out of her beak. But the sparrow opened her mouth wide and revealed a shiny new tongue, as if she had just upgraded her model. Forget the past, she chirped. I'm doing just fine now. In that moment, the old man realized his sparrow was no ordinary bird. She was a fairy. Talk about a plot twist. His heart soared like a kite in a summer breeze. All his worries vanished, and he even forgot how tired he was. Instead of finding a sick little bird, he discovered a happy, healthy fairy with a brand new tongue. And the best part? She showed no signs of the mistreatment from his cranky old wife. The sparrow beckoned him to follow her, and with a flutter, she led him to a stunning house nestled in the heart of the bamboo grove. When he stepped inside, he was blown away. The place was a dream, built from the whitest wood. The soft cream mats were like clouds underfoot, and the cushions? Oh, they were the finest silk and crepe, fit for royalty. Beautiful vases and lacquer boxes adorned every corner, like a Pinterest board come to life. The sparrow led him to the seat of honor, and from a respectful distance, she bowed and thanked him for all the kindness he had shown her over the years. Lady Sparrow, we'll call her from now on, then introduced her family. Her daughters, dressed in delicate crepe gowns, brought in a feast that made the old man think he'd stepped into a food coma. Just when he thought it couldn't get better, some of the sparrow's daughters performed the Suzumodori, or the sparrow's dance. It was like a Broadway show, but with more feathers and less drama. He had never had such a delightful time. The hours flew by faster than a cat chasing a laser pointer, surrounded by these enchanting sparrows who catered to his every whim. But as night fell, reality hit him like a cold splash of water. He had a long journey back home and needed to take his leave. He thanked his gracious hostess for the splendid evening and asked her to forget all the unpleasantness from his wife. It warmed his heart to see her thriving in such a beautiful home. Now that he knew she was happy, he could return home with a light heart. If she ever needed him, all she had to do was send a little tweet. The lady sparrow insisted he stay a few more days to enjoy the change of scenery. But the old man, ever the dutiful husband, said he must return to his cranky wife, who was probably fuming at his late arrival. As much as he wanted to linger, he couldn't accept her generous invitation. But now that he knew where she lived, he promised to visit whenever he could. Seeing he wouldn't stay longer, the lady sparrow ordered her servants to bring in 2 boxes, one large and one small. "Pick one as a gift," she chirped, her eyes sparkling. The old man couldn't refuse such kindness. He chose the smaller box, saying, "I'm too old and feeble for the big one. I'll take the small one. It'll be easier to carry." The sparrows helped him strap it on his back, and they all gathered at the gate, bidding him farewell with many bows, wishing him to come again soon. The old man and his beloved sparrow parted ways happily, with her showing no bitterness for the past. Instead, she felt pity for him, the one stuck with the cranky old wife. When he finally reached home, he found his wife even crosser than usual, waiting up for him like a hawk. "Where have you been all this time?" she bellowed. "Why are you so late?" In an effort to calm her down, he revealed the box of treasures he had brought back, excited to share his adventure. "Let's see what's inside," he said, cutting off her grumbling before it could escalate. They both sat down and opened the box, and to their utter astonishment, it was filled to the brim with gold and silver coins, along with other precious goodies. The mats of their little cottage sparkled as they pulled out the treasures, handling them like they were delicate eggs. The old man was overjoyed, his heart swelling with happiness at the sight of his newfound riches. The sparrow's gift was beyond anything he could have imagined, allowing him to finally retire from work and live comfortably for the rest of his days. Who knew a little bird could change his life so dramatically? He said, "Thanks to my good little sparrow. Thanks to my good little sparrow," over and over again like a broken record of gratitude. But you know how it goes. Once the initial thrill of shiny gold and silver wore off, the old woman's greed kicked in like a bad habit. She started to berate the old man for not bringing home the big box of presents. I mean, come on, right? In his innocent little heart, He had told her how he turned down the hefty box the sparrows offered, opting for the lighter one instead. Smart move, but not smart enough to avoid her wrath. "You silly old man," she screeched, her voice sharper than a crow's caw. "Why didn't you bring the large box? Just think of all the treasure we've lost. We could have had twice as much silver and gold. You're such a fool." And with that, she stormed off to bed, fuming, like a kettle on the verge of boiling over. Now, the old man was regretting ever mentioning that big box. But alas, it was too late. The greedy old woman, not satisfied with the unexpected windfall they had received, one she barely deserved, decided she was going to get more. Because why not? Bright and early the next morning, she sprang out of bed, ready to hunt down that sparrow. The old man tried to dissuade her, but his words were like whispers in a storm. She was determined, and it's a bit odd, don't you think? She didn't even feel a twinge of shame for visiting the sparrow after she had cruelly cut off its tongue in a fit of rage. But greed has a way of clouding judgment, doesn't it? It didn't even cross her mind that the sparrows might be a tad upset with her, and trust me, they were. Ever since the lady sparrow had returned home, weeping and bleeding from the mouth, her family had been buzzing with outrage. How could she do that? They asked, shaking their little heads. For just a bit of rice paste? That's a bit much, don't you think? They adored the old man, the kind-hearted soul who endured so much. But the old woman? They wanted to see her get what was coming to her. And oh, how the universe was about to deliver. After what felt like an eternity of wandering, the old woman finally stumbled upon the bamboo grove. Standing there, she hollered, "Where is the tongue-cut sparrow's house? Where is the tongue-cut sparrow's house?" Eventually, she spotted the eaves of the house peeking through the bamboo like a shy child. She rushed to the door and knocked, probably harder than necessary. When the lady sparrow heard her old mistress was at the door, she was taken aback. I mean, after everything that had happened, who wouldn't be a little surprised? But being the polite bird she was, she stepped out to greet the old woman, remembering the days when she was her mistress. But the old woman? She had no time for pleasantries. She cut right to the chase, no shame in her game. "You don't need to entertain me like you did my old man. I'm here to get the box he foolishly left behind. Just give me the big box, and I'll be on my way." The lady sparrow, probably rolling her eyes internally, agreed and instructed her servants to fetch the big box. The old woman snatched it up, hoisted it onto her back, and without so much as a thank you, she hurried off, eager to see what treasures awaited her. But oh, the box was heavier than a sack of bricks. She couldn't walk fast, let alone run, despite her burning desire to get home and unveil the riches she imagined were inside. She had to stop and rest more times than she could count, each pause filled with anticipation. Finally, her curiosity got the better of her. She plopped the box down by the roadside and opened it, expecting a dazzling display of gold and jewels. Instead, what popped out made her scream louder than a banshee. Horrific demons leaped from the box, surrounding her like a bad horror movie. Seriously, not even in her worst nightmares had she encountered such ghastly creatures. One demon had a single, enormous eye right in the middle of its forehead, glaring at her like it had just found its next meal. Others had mouths wide enough to swallow her whole, and a snake coiled around her, hissing like it was auditioning for a role in a thriller. The old woman was terrified, running faster than she ever had in her life, her legs shaking like jelly. When she finally made it home, she collapsed on the floor, breathless, and recounted her harrowing tale to her husband, tears streaming down her face. "The demons! They nearly killed me." But before she could start blaming the sparrow, the old man cut her off. "Don't blame the sparrow. It's your wickedness that's finally caught up with you. I hope this serves as a lesson for you." From that day on, the old woman kept her mouth shut and her heart open. Gradually, she transformed into a kinder soul, so much so that her husband hardly recognized her. They spent their remaining days together in peace, free from want or care, cherishing the treasure the old man had received from his dear little sparrow. Long, long ago, in a little fishing village called Mizuno-Yi, nestled along the shores of Japan, there lived a young fisherman named Urashima Taro. Now, Urashima wasn't just any fisherman. He was the best in the whole countryside. I mean, this guy could catch more bonito and tai in a single day than his buddies could manage in a week. Talk about fishing skills. But more than his impressive catch, Urashima was known for his kind heart. Seriously, this guy wouldn't hurt a fly, or a tortoise for that matter. As a boy, his friends would tease him for not joining in their cruel games with animals. Instead of throwing rocks or pulling tails, he'd be the one trying to rescue the poor creatures. You know, the kind of kid who probably had a secret stash of pets hidden under his bed. One soft summer evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of peach and lavender, Urashima was heading home after a long day of fishing. Suddenly, he stumbled upon a ruckus. A group of children were screaming and laughing, but not in a good way. They were tormenting a tortoise. One kid was pulling it this way, another was yanking it that way, while a third was whacking it with a stick. I mean, come on, kids. What's wrong with you? Feeling a surge of compassion, Urashima stepped in. "Hey, boys," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You're treating that poor tortoise so badly that it will soon die." But, of course, the kids, being the delightful little monsters they were, just laughed him off. One of the older boys sneered, "Who cares if it lives or dies? We don't." And just like that, they resumed their cruel antics. Urashima took a deep breath, trying to think of a way to save the tortoise without resorting to a wrestling match with a bunch of kids. "Listen, I'm sure you're all good boys at heart," he said, flashing them a smile that could charm the scales off a fish. "How about you give me the tortoise and I'll pay you for it? I'll be your uncle and buy it from you." He held up some coins strung on a piece of string, glinting in the fading sunlight. "You can buy all sorts of fun stuff with this money." Surprisingly, the boys weren't entirely bad. They were just a bit mischievous. Urashima's gentle words and warm smile began to work their magic. Slowly, they approached him, the ringleader finally holding out the tortoise. "All right, Uncle, we'll give you the tortoise for the money." And just like that, Urashima exchanged his coins for the tortoise, while the boys scampered off, probably to find something else to torment. Urashima gently stroked the tortoise's back, whispering, "Oh, you poor thing, you're safe now. They say storks live for 1,000 years, but you, my friend, can live for 10,000. You were in real danger there." With that, he hurried to the shore, plopped the tortoise back into the water, and watched it swim away, feeling a sense of satisfaction wash over him. The next morning, Urashima set out in his boat, the sea sparkling under the soft summer sun. It was one of those mornings where everything feels just right, you know? He pushed out to sea, casting his line and drifting further away from the other boats. For some reason, he felt unusually happy, wishing he had the tortoise's long lifespan instead of his own fleeting human years. Suddenly, he heard a voice calling his name, clear as a bell and as soft as a summer breeze. "Urashima, Urashima." He stood up, scanning the horizon, but there were no boats in sight. Was he losing it? Then, to his surprise, he spotted a familiar figure gliding through the water. It was the very tortoise he had rescued. "Well, Mr. Tortoise," Urashima chuckled, "was it you who called my name just now?" The tortoise nodded its head, saying, "Yes, it was I. Yesterday, in your honorable shadow, my life was saved. I've come to thank you and express my gratitude for your kindness." "Wow, that's quite polite of you," Urashima replied, amused. "Come on up into the boat. I'd offer you a smoke, but I guess that's not your style." He chuckled at his own joke. "Hee," the tortoise laughed back. "Sake is my favorite refreshment, but I could do without the tobacco." "Indeed," said Urashima. "I regret very much that I have no sake in my boat to offer you, but come up and dry your back in the sun. Tortoises always love to do that." So, the tortoise climbed into the boat, with a little help from the fisherman, and after a few polite exchanges, the tortoise asked, "Have you ever seen Rin-Jin, the palace of the Dragon King of the Sea, Urashima?" Urashima shook his head. "No, year after year. The sea has been my home, but though I've heard whispers of the Dragon King's realm beneath the waves, I've never laid eyes on that magical place." It must be pretty far away, if it even exists at all. Is that really so? You've never seen the Sea King's palace? Oh, you're missing out on one of the most incredible sights in the whole universe. It's deep down at the bottom of the sea, but if you let me take you there, we'll arrive in no time. I'll be your guide. I'd love to go, truly, but you must remember, I'm just a humble mortal. I can't swim like a sea creature such as yourself. Before Urashima could finish, the tortoise interrupted. What? You don't need to swim. Just hop on my back, and I'll take you without any trouble on your part. But, Urashima protested, how can I ride on your small back? It may seem absurd, but I assure you you can. Just try it. Come on. Get on my back and see if it's as impossible as you think. As the tortoise finished speaking, Urashima glanced at its shell, and lo and behold, the creature had suddenly grown so large that a man could easily sit upon it. This is strange indeed, Urashima exclaimed. Then, Mr. Tortoise, with your kind permission, I will get on your back. Dokoisho, he shouted as he jumped on, with a face as calm as a still pond, as if this were the most ordinary thing in the world. The tortoise said, now we will set out at our leisure. And with that, he leapt into the sea. Urashima perched on his back. Down they dove, gliding through the water like a couple of old pals. Urashima never grew tired, nor did his clothes get damp. After what felt like an eternity or maybe just a few minutes far in the distance, a magnificent gate appeared, with the long, sloping roofs of a palace peeking over the horizon. Yeah, Urashima exclaimed. That looks like the gate of some grand palace. Mr. Tortoise, can you tell what that place is? That is the great gate of the Rin-Jin Palace. The large roof you see behind it is the Sea King's palace itself. Then we've finally arrived in the realm of the Sea King, Urashima said, excitement bubbling in his chest. Yes, indeed, replied the tortoise. And don't you think we got here pretty quickly? As he spoke, they reached the side of the gate. And here we are. You must walk from here. The tortoise led the way, addressing the gatekeeper, who was, amusingly enough, a fish. This is Urashima Taro from Japan. I've had the honor of bringing him as a visitor to this kingdom. Please show him the way. The gatekeeper nodded and promptly led them through the gate. Out came the red bream, the flounder, the sole, the cuttlefish, and all the chief vassals of the Dragon King of the Sea, bowing courtly to welcome the newcomer. Urashima-sama, welcome to the Sea Palace, the home of the Dragon King of the Sea. Thrice welcome, having come from such a distant land. And you, Mr. Tortoise, we owe you a great debt for bringing Urashima here. Then, turning back to Urashima, they said, please follow us this way. And the whole fishy entourage became his guides. Urashima, being just a simple fisher lad, wasn't quite sure how to act in a palace. But oddly enough, he felt no shame or embarrassment. He followed his finned friends calmly into the inner palace. As he reached the grand portals, a stunning princess emerged, accompanied by her maidens. She was more beautiful than any human he'd ever seen, draped in flowing garments of red and soft green, reminiscent of the underside of a wave, with golden threads shimmering through her gown. Her lovely black hair cascaded over her shoulders like a waterfall, and when she spoke, her voice was like music dancing over the water. Urashima was utterly spellbound, lost in wonder, unable to utter a single word. Then, remembering his manners, he prepared to bow, but before he could even bend, the princess took his hand and led him to a beautiful hall, to the seat of honor at the upper end, and bade him sit. Urashima Taro, it gives me the highest pleasure to welcome you to my father's kingdom, said the princess. Yesterday, you set free a tortoise, and I have sent for you to thank you for saving my life, for I was that tortoise. Now, if you'd like, you can live here forever in the land of eternal youth, where summer never dies and sorrow never comes. I will be your bride, if you wish, and we shall live together happily ever after. As Urashima listened to her sweet words and gazed upon her enchanting face, his heart swelled with wonder and joy, and he replied, half wondering if it was all just a dream. Thank you 1,000 times for your kind words. There's nothing I could wish for more than to stay here with you in this beautiful land, of which I've often heard but never seen until now. Beyond all words, this is the most wonderful place I have ever seen." While he was speaking, a parade of fish glided in, all decked out in their finest ceremonial garb, looking like they were ready for a royal wedding. Oh wait, they were. One by one, they entered the hall with a grace that would put any ballroom dancer to shame, carrying coral trays piled high with delicacies of fish and seaweed that would make even the most gourmet chef drool. This was no ordinary feast. It was a banquet fit for a king, and the bride and groom were about to dive into a culinary experience like no other. The Sea King's realm was alive with joy, and as soon as the happy couple toasted with their wedding cup of wine 3 times 3, because why not, the music kicked in, and fish with shimmering silver scales and golden tails danced in from the waves. Urashima was in heaven, savoring every moment of this extraordinary feast. Never had he experienced anything quite like it. Once the last morsel was devoured, the princes asked Urashima if he wanted a tour of the palace. Oh, you bet he did. Following his stunning bride, the Sea King's daughter, he was led through a world where youth and joy frolicked hand in hand, untouched by the cruel hands of time. The palace itself was a masterpiece, crafted from coral and adorned with pearls so dazzling that even a poet might struggle to find the right words to describe it. But for Urashima, the real magic lay in the garden that surrounded the palace. It was like stepping into a living painting, where all 4 seasons coexisted in a riot of color and life. First, he turned eastward, and there they were, the plum and cherry trees bursting with blossoms, nightingales serenading in the pink avenues, and butterflies flitting about like they were auditioning for a nature documentary. Then he looked south, where summer reigned supreme. The trees were lush and green, and the air was filled with the cheerful chirping of cicadas and crickets, nature's own soundtrack. To the west, autumn put on a show, with maples ablaze in fiery reds and golds, while the chrysanthemums stood proudly in full bloom, like nature's own fireworks display. But when Urashima glanced north, his heart skipped a beat. The landscape transformed into a winter wonderland, with snow blanketing everything in a soft, white embrace. Trees and bamboos wore their frosty coats, and the pond was frozen solid, like a giant ice rink just waiting for a skating party. Every day brought new wonders for Urashima, and his happiness was so immense that he completely forgot about everything he had left behind his home, his parents, even his old fishing rod. 3 days slipped by without a single thought of the outside world. But then, like a sudden chill in the air, reality hit him. Oh dear, he thought, I can't just lounge around here forever. What about my old father and mother? They must be worried sick. I need to go back like yesterday. And with that, he sprang into action, preparing for his journey with a sense of urgency that would make a caffeine-fueled squirrel proud. He approached his beautiful wife, the princess, bowing low as he spoke. Otoheim-sama, he said, I've had the most incredible time with you, but I must return to my parents. They need me. Tears welled in Otoheim's eyes as she replied softly, Isn't it wonderful here, Urashima? Why the rush? Just stay with me for one more day. But Urashima's sense of duty was stronger than any romantic notion. I really must go, he insisted. It's not that I want to leave you. I just can't abandon my parents. Just one day, and I promise I'll come back. Sighing, the princess said, Then there's nothing more to be done. I'll send you back today, but first, take this as a token of our love. She presented him with a beautiful lacquer box, tied with a silken cord and adorned with red silk tassels. Urashima felt a twinge of guilt. He had already received so much from her. Are you sure I can take this? It feels wrong to accept another gift after all you've given me, he said, hesitating. It's precious, she replied, but you must promise me one thing. Never, ever open this box. If you do, something dreadful will happen to you. Promise me. And of course, Urashima, caught up in the moment, promised he would never, ever open the box. With a heavy heart, he bid farewell to Otoheim-sama and made his way down to the seashore, where a large tortoise awaited him. He climbed onto its back, and off they went, gliding over the shimmering sea toward the east. He turned back to wave at Otoheim until she faded into the distance, along with the magical land of the Sea King and the palace that felt like a dream. Finally, the tortoise brought him back to the familiar bay he had known all his life. He stepped onto the shore, looking around, but something felt off. A strange unease washed over him as he noticed the people passing by. They looked different, like a cast of characters from a bizarre play he had never auditioned for. His heart raced as he hurried toward his old home. Even that looked different, but there it stood, a house in the same spot. "Father, I'm back," he called out, ready to burst through the door, when a strange man emerged instead. "Maybe my parents moved while I was away," he thought, anxiety creeping in like an unwelcome guest. What was going on? Why did everything feel so unfamiliar? "Excuse me," said Urashima Taro, glancing at the man who was staring at him like he'd just seen a ghost. "But until a few days ago, I lived in this house. Where have my parents gone?" The man's expression shifted from bewilderment to something resembling disbelief, and he squinted at Urashima's face as if trying to decipher a riddle. "What? Are you really Urashima Taro?" "Yes," Urashima insisted, feeling a bit like a fish out of water. "I am Urashima Taro." The man burst into laughter, a sound that echoed like a bad joke. "Oh, come on. You can't be serious. There was a guy named Urashima Taro who lived here, but that was 300 years ago. He's long gone, buddy." Urashima's heart sank. "Please, don't joke with me. I'm really Urashima Taro, and I definitely haven't lived for 300 years. Just a few days ago, I was right here. Can you please tell me what's going on without all this nonsense?" But the man's face turned serious, like he'd just bitten into a lemon. "You might be Urashima Taro, or you might not be. But the Urashima Taro I know is a legend from 300 years ago. Maybe you're just his spirit, come back to haunt your old home." "Why are you mocking me?" Urashima exclaimed, feeling a mix of frustration and confusion. "I'm no spirit. Look at my feet." He stomped on the ground, first one foot, then the other like a toddler throwing a tantrum. "Because, Japanese ghosts don't have feet." "But Urashima Taro lived 300 years ago," the man insisted, his voice dripping with skepticism. "It's all written in the village chronicles." Urashima was lost in a fog of bewilderment. He glanced around, feeling like he'd stepped into a bizarre dream. Everything looked different, and a chilling realization crept over him. What if the man was right? Those few days he spent in the Sea King's palace felt like a blink, but maybe they had stretched into centuries. His parents were gone, and everyone he ever knew had vanished, leaving behind only stories. There was no point in staying here. He needed to return to his beautiful wife beyond the sea. He trudged back to the beach, clutching the box the princess had given him. But which way was it? He felt lost like a sock in the dryer. Then it hit him, the Tamate Bako. The princess said never to open it, he recalled, that it held something precious. But now that I've lost everything, if I open it, maybe I'll find something to guide me back to my lovely princess. His heart raced with desperation. What do I have to lose? I'll open the box. With a mix of excitement and dread, he untied the red silk cord, lifting the lid slowly, like peeling back the layers of a mystery. And what did he find? A beautiful little purple cloud floated out in 3 soft wisps. For a fleeting moment, it danced around him, reluctant to leave, before drifting away like a wisp of smoke over the sea. In an instant, Urashima felt the weight of time crash down on him. He went from a strong, handsome youth of 24 to an old man, hunched over with age, his hair turning snowy white, his face a map of wrinkles. And just like that, he collapsed on the beach, lifeless. Poor Urashima. Because of his disobedience, he could never return to the Sea King's realm or to the lovely princess waiting for him beyond the waves. So, little ones, remember this. Never disregard the wisdom of those who know better. Disobedience can lead you down a path of miseries and sorrows, and trust me, nobody wants that kind of bedtime story. "Thank you for your kindness," said the old woman, her voice trembling like a leaf in the wind. But I can't let you do this work for me. I mustn't untie you or you might escape. And trust me, my husband would not be pleased if he came home to find you gone. Now, let me tell you, badgers are some of the sneakiest critters out there. This one, with a voice as soft as a whispering breeze, replied, "You are very unkind. Just untie me, and I promise I won't run away. If you're worried about your husband, I'll let you tie me back up before he gets home. I'm so tired and sore being all tied up like this. If you could just let me down for a few minutes, I'd be forever grateful." The old woman, bless her heart, had a good and simple nature. She couldn't imagine that this badger was spinning a web of deceit just to make a break for it. Feeling a twinge of sympathy as she looked at him hanging there, legs all bound and looking like a sad little piñata, she decided to trust him. With a gentle touch, she untied the cord and let him down. Once free, the badger took the wooden pestle she handed him, but instead of doing the work, he lunged at the old woman and knocked her down with a thud that echoed through the little house. And just like that, he turned her into soup, waiting for her husband to return. The old farmer, toiling away in the fields, was blissfully unaware of the horror unfolding at home. All he could think about was how he'd finally rid himself of that pesky badger. As the sun dipped low, he wrapped up his work, fatigue settling in like a heavy blanket. But the thought of a warm bowl of badger soup waiting for him made him quicken his pace. Little did he know, the badger was already cooking up something far more sinister. The badger, now in the old woman's form, greeted him on the porch with a smile that could only be described as devilish. "So you've come back at last. I've made the badger soup and have been waiting for you for ages." The old farmer, none the wiser, slipped off his straw sandals and settled down, ready for dinner. He asked for the soup, completely oblivious to the fact that he was being served a bowl of his own wife. Then, in a twist that would make any soap opera writer proud, the badger transformed back into his true self and cackled, "You wife-eating old man, watch out for the bones in the kitchen." With that, he bolted out of the house, leaving the farmer in a state of shock. It took a moment for the old man to process what had just happened, and when he did, horror washed over him like a cold wave. He fainted right there, and when he came to, the tears flowed like a river. His faithful wife, gone, cooked up by the very creature he thought he had outsmarted. The thought of almost sipping that soup made him wail, "Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear." Not far away, a kind-hearted old rabbit heard the commotion and hopped over to see what was wrong. The farmer poured out his heart, sharing the tragic tale of betrayal. The rabbit, filled with righteous anger, promised to avenge the old woman's death. The farmer, finally finding a glimmer of hope, wiped his tears and thanked the rabbit for his kindness. With the farmer calming down, the rabbit hopped back home to plot his revenge against the dastardly badger. The next day dawned bright and beautiful, perfect for a little payback. The rabbit searched high and low but couldn't find the badger anywhere. Finally, he tracked him down hiding in his den, scared stiff after his last escapade. "Why are you hiding on such a lovely day?" the rabbit called out. "Come on out. Let's go cut grass on the hills together." The badger, thinking the rabbit was his buddy, eagerly agreed, glad to escape the farmer's territory. They ventured far from home, to a hill where the grass grew thick and sweet, perfect for winter storage. They both worked hard, cutting as much as they could carry. But here's where the rabbit's plan kicked in. As they walked back, the rabbit made the badger go first. Then, with a sly grin, he pulled out a flint and steel, striking it over the badger's back. "What's that noise?" the badger asked, hearing the crackling sound. "Oh, that's nothing," the rabbit replied, feigning innocence. "Just the sound of crackling mountain." Before the badger could process that, the fire spread through the dry grass on his back. "What's happening?" he yelped, panic rising in his voice. "Welcome to the burning mountain," the rabbit exclaimed, as the flames danced and flickered, turning the badger's day from bad to worse in a heartbeat. By this time, the badger was in a bit of a pickle, or should I say, a burnt bundle of fur. Yep, all the hair on his back was gone, singed away like a bad haircut gone wrong. He could smell the smoke from the burning grass and, let me tell you, it wasn't a pleasant aroma. Screaming in agony, he dashed to his hole, hoping for some sweet relief. But, of course, the rabbit was right on his tail, finding him sprawled out on his bed, groaning like a sad old man. "What an unlucky fellow you are," the rabbit chirped, feigning sympathy. "I can't imagine how this happened, but don't worry. I'll whip up some medicine that'll have you feeling better in no time." Oh, the rabbit was practically skipping with glee, thinking about the badger's misfortune. After all, the badger had done a terrible thing, murdering a poor, helpless old woman who had trusted him. So, a little poetic justice never hurt anyone, right? Off went the rabbit, concocting a delightful potion of sauce and red pepper, because nothing says healing quite like a fiery burn cream. Am I right? He returned to the badger, who was still groaning away, and said, "Now, this is going to hurt like the devil, but trust me, it's a miracle cure for burns." The badger, desperate for relief, begged him to apply it immediately. And oh boy, the moment that red pepper hit his scorched back, it was like setting off fireworks in a dry field. He rolled around, howling like a banshee, while the rabbit watched with a smirk, feeling like the farmer's wife was finally getting her revenge. The badger was stuck in bed for about a month, but eventually, despite the rabbit's spicy remedy, he healed up. And when the rabbit saw that the badger was on the mend, he thought, time for round 2. So he paid the badger a visit, pretending to be all friendly and congratulatory. During their chat, the rabbit casually mentioned he was going fishing, painting a picture of serene waters and smooth sailing. The badger, forgetting all about his recent misadventures, perked up. "Oh, that sounds delightful. Can I join you next time?" The rabbit's heart did a little dance. This was exactly what he wanted to hear. Back home, he got to work building 2 boats. One sturdy wooden beauty for himself and a clay disaster for the badger. Because nothing says friendship like a sinking vessel, right? When the day finally arrived for their fishing trip, the badger was thrilled with his new clay boat, completely oblivious to the rabbit's sinister plan. They set off, and after a while, the rabbit suggested a little race to see whose boat was faster. The badger, eager to show off, agreed. But as they rowed, the badger's boat began to crumble, the water softening the clay like a bad cookie in milk. Panic set in, and he cried out for help. But the rabbit, with a wicked grin, replied, "Oh, I'm just avenging the old woman's murder. This was my plan all along." With that, he raised his oar and struck the badger, who went down with his sinking ship, disappearing beneath the waves. And just like that, the rabbit had fulfilled his promise to the old farmer. After rowing back to shore, the rabbit hurried to tell the farmer the good news. The old man, tears of relief in his eyes, thanked the rabbit profusely. He had been haunted by his wife's death, unable to find peace. But now he could finally sleep easy. He invited the rabbit to stay with him, and from that day on, they lived together as the best of friends, sharing tales and laughter until the end of their days.